Okay, so welcome back, YouTube. We're here to do our third installment of Why Study Feminism. And today's presentation is called U.S. Women of Color Feminism, including intersectionality. I'm going to start first with my dissertation, a part of my dissertation, where I wrote a history of U.S. women of color feminism. And I want to show how there was a line of thinking before intersectionality arrived on the scene. And intersectionality is one of the most well-known theories, social theories, to hit popular culture, really. And it was a build-up by U.S. women of color theorizing. So I'm going to read several passages from my dissertation that shows one history of U.S. women of color feminism and how it leads up to intersectionality. And then we're going to cover intersectionality as spoken by Kimberly Crenshaw in its first articulations. So many women of color in the United States have experienced the importance of collectivity based on the commonalities of women. At the same time, they have seen this term erase important differences between women. In their material lives of work and society, in their practical political projects, and in their rigorous analyses of this oppression, a discursive formation has been produced in scant activist publications on the margins of the university. As a discursive political formation and in response to larger white feminist social movements, U.S. women of color have deconstructed binary oppositions, male, female, black, white, and exposed false unities which invalidate different aspects of their social experiences. Sojourner Truth is often cited as the first woman of color to have been documented articulating this attention to difference in gender constructions. Quote, "Dat man over there say dat women needs to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place ever war. Nobody ever helped me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best places. And ain't I a woman?" As the women's movement began in the United States in the 1960s, various women of color eventually separated from this dominant movement because its agenda did not clearly assume anti-racist commitments. In 1970, Frances Beale wrote in her article, "Double Jeopardy to be Black and Female," that, quote, "any white group that does not have an anti-imperialist and anti-racist ideology has absolutely nothing in common with the Black woman's struggle. Given this, woman, in quotes, is a false unity in political, social, and cultural conditions of the United States, because being a woman is defined socially by different forces, including racism and classism." Cherie Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa opened a book called "This Bridge Called My Back" in 1980 by identifying differences that further illustrate a myriad of subjective locations that define woman differently. Quote, "We are the colored in a white feminist movement. We are the feminists among the people of color. We are often the lesbians among the straight," end quote. 8 years later, in 1990, Norma Alarcón worked to explain theoretically the historical subjectivity that "This Bridge Called My Back" documented. Commenting on this, Alarcón wrote that, quote, "The female subject of This Bridge Called My Back, is highly complex. She is and has been constructed in a crisis of meaning situation which includes racial and cultural divisions and conflicts. Clearly, this exploration appears impossible without a reconfiguration of the subject of feminist theory and her relational position to a multiplicity of others, not just white men. Moving in a similar direction, Deborah K. King published an essay in 1988 entitled Multiple Jeopardy, Multiple Consciousness: The Context of a Black Feminist Ideology. In reference to Frances Beale's earlier essay by almost 20 years, King articulates a theory concerning the formative interdependency between social oppressions and the subjectivities within discursive and material histories. In response to what she calls, quote, the monist approach of most liberation ideologies, end quote, she says that, quote, the triple jeopardy of racism, sexism, and classism is now widely accepted and used as the conceptualization of Black women's status. However, while advancing our understanding beyond the erasure of Black women within the confines of the race-sex analogy, it does not yet fully convey the dynamics of multiple forms of discrimination. In order to understand the social oppression in life, King offers a theory of, quote, multiple jeopardy and multiple consciousness. Now you can see that these references to double jeopardy and multiple jeopardy are references to legal terms, that we cannot be tried for the same crime twice. So the message here is that being Black and female and perhaps working class sort of damns you 3 times. It charges you 3 times for the same subjectivity. Contemporary critical theory that attempts to understand and analyze social oppression tends to be built on an additive model of analysis, a simplified history of the development of theoretical and political consciousness since Marxism. It shows a lineage of discovery such that class precedes race, which precedes sex, gender, sexuality, ability, age, etc., as categories that produce material social struggles. However, human lives and human behavior are not easily empirically categorizable into discrete units, and often the use of these fixed categories for analytical purposes simply reinstates their hegemony, their dominance. Our racialized, sexed, gendered, and classed experiences, identities, and differences are socially co-present and co-determinant of each other. They are also dynamic and, with this motion, co-transformative. Addressing the hierarchization, which additive and stabilized methodologies seem to almost inevitably resort to, King says, quote, such assertions ignore the fact that racism, sexism, and classism constitute 3 interdependent control systems. An interactive model, which I have termed multiple jeopardy, better captures those processes. The modifier multiple refers not only to several simultaneous oppressions, but to the multiplicative relationships among them as well. In other words, the equivalent formulation is racism multiplied by sexism multiplied by classism. So you can see this theory gaining analytical incisiveness, right? Though arising specifically out of a Black woman's perspective, I believe that multiple jeopardies can be seen to capture and signify the struggle and oppression of not only women of color, but of all social subjects who are primarily on the edges of, though in and crossing over the dominance of popular Western cultures. However, before attempting to generalize the theory, King also cites Bonnie Thornton Dill and says that she has discussed, quote, the importance of scholars recognizing, incorporating, and interpreting the complex variety of social roles that Black women have performed in reaction to multiple jeopardies, end quote, in social relations. That is, the multiplicity as a model of analysis is not only analytical and politically defensive, but this view also illustrates the integrated quality of all of our lives. Via this social integration, social characters and roles emerge and are performed, adapted, and habituated in subjective locations. And yet, despite the formation of roles and characters of lived survival, these too are always changing according to the specific context and particularity of individuals and interactions. The multiplicity exists for all of us. I take this theory one step further in order to argue for a larger use of it to include the construction of all of our subjectivities, dominant and subcultural. Now we move to Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw articulated intersectionality. The first time that I was exposed to it was in 1994, I think, in a graduate seminar on women of color in the United States, taught by Professor Angela Davis in the History of Consciousness program at UC Santa Cruz. Kimberly Crenshaw is what we're going to discuss now and how she articulates intersectionality from the original essay. The original essay is called Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. So what I'd like to make sure we point to is that intersectionality was articulated as an attempt to understand this multiplicity, the multiple jeopardies that women of color in the United States experience, perhaps around the world as well, as women of color articulate what is happening for them. So from Kimberly Crenshaw, quote, drawing from the strength of shared experiences, women have recognized that the political demands of millions speak more powerfully than the pleas of a few isolated voices. This politicization, in turn, has transformed the way we understand violence against women. For example, battering and rape, once seen as private family matters and aberrational, errant sexual aggression, are now largely recognized as part of a broad-scale system of domination that affects women as a class. This process of recognizing as social and systemic what was formerly perceived as isolated and individual has also characterized the identity politics of people of color and gays and lesbians, among others. For all of these groups, identity-based politics has been a source of strength, community, and intellectual development. He continues to say, in her interrogation of how women of color are served in the United States when suffering domestic violence. She says, quote, race, gender, and other identity categories are most often treated in mainstream liberal discourse as vestiges of bias or domination. That is, as intrinsically negative frameworks in which social power works to exclude or marginalize those who are different. She continues, quote, yet implicit in certain strands of feminist and racial liberation movements, for example, is the view that the social power in delineating difference need not be the power of domination. It can instead be the source of political empowerment and social reconstruction. So again, what is she talking about here? She's talking about how the identity categories of race, gender, class, sexuality are important methodologies to understand what is happening socially in the hierarchies, the social hierarchies that put some people on top and some people further down, the ladder, so to speak. Kimberly Crenshaw continues, quote, although racism and sexism readily intersect in the lives of real people, they seldom do in feminist and anti-racism practices. And so when the practices expound identity as woman, or person of color as an either-or proposition. They relegate the identity of women of color to a location that resists telling. So this point here is, to me, very fascinating because it shows how we can be invisibilized, how women of color in particular can be invisibilized when they fall through the cracks of analysis, really. Here's her thesis. Quote, "My objective here is to advance the telling of that location by exploring the race and gender dimension of violence against women of color. Contemporary feminist and anti-racism discourses have failed to consider the intersections of racism and patriarchy. Focusing on two dimensions of male violence against women, battering and rape, I consider how the experiences of women of color are frequently the product of intersecting patterns of racism and sexism, and how these experiences tend not to be represented within the discourse of either feminism or anti-racism. Because of their intersectional identity as both women and people of color within discourses that are shaped to respond to one or the other, the interests and experiences of women of color are frequently marginalized within both." She says, quote, "I build on these observations here by exploring the various ways in which race and gender intersect in shaping structural and political aspects of violence against women of color. My focus on the intersections of race and gender only highlights the need to account for multiple grounds of identity when considering how the social world is constructed." Quote, in the first part of her essay, she says she will discuss structural intersectionality, the ways in which the location of women of color at the intersection of race and gender makes our actual experience of domestic violence, rape, and remedial reform qualitatively different from that of white women. I shift the focus in the second part to political intersectionality, where I analyze how both feminist and anti-racist politics have functioned in tandem to marginalize the issue of violence against women of color. Finally, I address the implications of the intersectional approach within the broader scope of contemporary identity politics, end quote. So she then goes specifically into her analysis of shelters, domestic violence victim shelters, and how these can underserve women of color for various reasons. She says, quote, "Shelters serving these women cannot afford to address only the violence inflicted by the batterer. They must also confront the other multi-layered and routinized forms of domination that often converge in these women's lives, hindering the ability to create alternatives to the abusive relationships that brought them to the shelters in the first place. Many women of color, for example, are burdened by poverty, childcare responsibilities, and the lack of job skills. These burdens, largely the consequence of gender and class oppression, are then compounded by the racially discriminatory employment and housing practices women of color often face. Women of color are burdened as well by the disproportionately high unemployment among people of color that make battered women of color less able to depend on the support of friends and relatives for temporary shelter. Their experiences reveal how diverse structures intersect, since even the class dimension is not independent of race and gender. So, what I would like to bring intersectionality back to is its long history in women of color feminism in the United States. Now, the articulations by women of color in the United States about the ways in which they were slipping through the analyses of social structures by being, again, either too dark in the white women's movement, feminist movement, and perhaps too feminist in people of color's movements to address racism. So wrapping intersectionality in this history of U.S. women of color feminism, I hope, is a way to ground it back to the analysis of women of color and how they can often fall through the cracks of both analysis and social structures. So my final comment is that though all of these methodological insights and theoretical efforts are out there, in the sense that they are now published and circulating discursively, writings by women of color remain relatively marginalized within the university and its supporting institutional publishing structures, just as women of color are equally absent from power positions in educational and other social institutions. So this is my attempt, one more time, to bring intersectionality back to its roots in U.S. women of color feminism. Intersectionality has a lot of cultural capital right now, and it has spread through the culture in ways that I did not predict when I was teaching feminism at the university, 2000, 2004. I hear often from clients and young people that they have learned how intersectionality applies. But I also see a lot of extended practice, let us say, cultural practices and social practices, including in DEI, diversity education. This is why you should study feminism. It has many theories, but intersectionality in particular has reached a moment in our intellectual and popular discourses that requires attention. And although it has various different applications that continue, I'd like to ground it in U.S. women of color feminist theory and ask that it be pulled back to its original application and purpose, which is to understand how the social stratification practices in our society, U.S. society, really bring double, triple, multiple jeopardy to some women of color who are attempting to survive. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for listening, YouTube. Please like, share, and subscribe. And consider our online courses on sex, gender, feminism, sexuality, multiracial identity, and other topics of interest. Thanks for staying in touch, and talk to you soon.